Hi, everybody. My name is Bettina Schultz-Job. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Natural Lifemanship. And we're honored to host part 2 of this webinar series with Vanessa Timmons and Bonnie Badenoch on racism and anti-racism. Today is part 2 called The Complicated Web. And what we're going to explore today is the intersection between our personal histories and systemic racism. If you didn't get a chance to listen to part 1, I highly recommend that you do. After that call, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, we got a ton of testimonials. Just people coming in and telling us how much they appreciated. Lots and lots of people talking about how safe the conversation felt, the tone of the conversation, how it felt really different to them than many other conversations they've had. There were a couple lines that people kept coming back to me with that they loved so much. One of the things Vanessa said is, "The truth requires a tenderness and a fine line." And truly, their conversation embodied that. It was an honor to get to be part of it. I'm going to read what a text message someone sent me. They quoted Vanessa again, and where she said, "How terrified we are to address this break we've had with one another." And this person said, "I'm listening to Bonnie and Vanessa, and I just love Vanessa's words here. They bring tears to my eyes. It elicits the grief that I'm sure others feel about this chasm between us." And they kind of go on and on. I posted them on Facebook recently. So I'm super excited to be here at part 2. Laura McFarland just said a minute ago, it's the highlight of her week. I feel that way as well. So in just a second, we really wanted to give people an opportunity to sort of enter the room. I think Vanessa put it that way, to enter the room, tell us where you're from. I love seeing all this. But I am going to turn off the chat box during the rest of this conversation, because the thing that's really important to Natural Lifemanship and to Vanessa and to Bonnie is that we're able to really embody this conversation. Feel it in our bodies, come into it, that it's not so much about the facts, it's about the connections that we're building. And we can get, I think, distracted by the chat box. But we do want your questions. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little spot that says Q&A. If you will put your questions there, several of us here who you see on the screen currently, we're going to be going away, but we will see. So just so you know who your questions are coming to and who's managing those. The number 1 person is Joe, or Joe, your full name is? Josephine, sorry. My great-grandmother was named Josephine. We called her JoJo, so I should know that. Anyway, Josephine is Bonnie's partner, and she is going to be the primary one on the call going through all the questions because we do not have time to hit them all. And so what will happen at times in this conversation is that Bonnie or Vanessa will say, "Hey, Joe, do you have any questions?" And she will pop back up on the screen. She will hopefully she will turn on her video and unmute herself. And if we have problems with that, we'll do it. If you were on the last call, you know that happened. And so Joe was looking at those questions. Tanner and Laura and I, Laura, are you on? Yes. Okay, so Tanner and Laura and I, we're all with Natural Lifemanship, and we're just helping manage technology, kind of behind the scenes. But we also can answer, if there's a quick answer to questions and things like that, just so you know so you have a face for the people who are sort of receiving your questions and filtering through them, okay? Also, after this call, Vanessa and Bonnie will get we're able to record the Q&A so that if there are questions that we did not get to, they will be able to get to them or try to get to some of them on the next call. I know they're trying to get to some of the questions from the last call, get to those today. Okay, so your questions are really, really important, and we just have limited time. Okay, so is there anything I'm forgetting, team?
Sounds great.
No. Thank
Good.
you. Y'all take it away. I am muting and turning off my video. You probably will not see me again. Thank you everybody for being here. It's an honor.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, my friend.
Hello, good morning. Although it's afternoon, lots of places, I suppose, right now.
It is. It's morning here in the Pacific Northwest. So I wanted us to just begin the way we love to begin. How are you doing? Checking in. What's happening for you in the last couple of weeks? How are you carrying all the events that you have faced? How are you doing?
Well, I'll tell you, we've had, both of us being from this area, it's been quite a couple of weeks with the tragedies of the fires, and it's really affected me a lot. We almost lost our home when I was 14 to a fire that got a block from our house, and so I can really feel into that.
Yeah.
And felt sad. I know so many migrant workers lost their homes in Oregon, and so that's been with me a lot. And then we've had so much smoke. I mean, we just haven't been able to breathe, and it keeps bringing back this theme of I can't breathe, whether it's George Floyd murder or COVID or now the smoke. It just seems like it's with us, like it's crying out to us in some way. So today I'm feeling grateful. I have my window here open to crack for the first time in maybe a week and a half, and the air is beginning to clear more. But the fires are still ongoing, and it feels like lots of things are on fire. So I'm kind of aware of that, but I feel very calmed by us being here together in the midst of it all. So I'm just grateful.
Yes.
How are you doing this morning?
Taking my first deep breath of the couple of weeks. It's here in Vancouver, Washington, where I live. It has been the air has been very, very thick. And I work with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And so there has been all over the state of Oregon where I work, people have just been struggling. There's such impact from the fires in Oregon. And I just send a heartfelt gratitude for the rains that showed up in their thunderous ways this morning, early around 3 a.m. Here in Vancouver, just kind of rumbling the houses and pouring down upon us. And I've never been so grateful for rain. I said a little prayer of gratitude for that. But it really resonates with me, what you said about I can't breathe. Like, I feel like this year has been that way with COVID and with fire and with smoke and with all of the things that has brought to our communities. Yeah, so that's there too, definitely.
Yeah, it is really something. I'm just so grateful they have you to help so many people that suffer through these times like this, and have refuge with you, my dear.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I wanted also just to remind folks that these are embodied conversations, right? It is, and just I want to offer an invitation to slow down, take a breath, kick your shoes off, feel the ground beneath your feet, feel your belly, let your shoulders fall, and just be with yourself wherever you are, to hear this story, to ask your questions, to be part of our offering of conversation and sisterhood and friendship that Bonnie and I invite you into with us. So, yeah, that's what I want to say about that. How about you, Bonnie?
Yeah, just that, to slow down and be in our bodies, especially today as we begin to talk more about our personal history, because that will well up in us as we begin to think about what our interactions have been, but more than think about them, to really feel into them and how they shape our perceptions and all of that. So again, just hearing your voice and feeling us together helps me settle into my body because I feel safe with you. And so it feels like I can let down into my embodied experience here as we move forward. And just want to invite everyone in whatever way that happens for you.
Yeah. Awesome. So Bonnie, I know that we wanted to start with some questions, but I also wanted us to talk a little bit about how we structured these chats. And, you know, we don't draft an agenda, or talking points or anything like that, that we do have. It's very much us kind of managing how we want to talk about deep subjects and how we want to bring our personal selves to these kind of complicated stories that are in the world about race, right, and white supremacy and history. And so it can look a little bit, I noticed in some of the questions last time that it could look like there was a sense of that we weren't quite in balance in terms of how much time each of us got to speak. So I just wanted to know that we probably aren't tending to that well, because we're just chatting with each other, and because we know each other so well, there's times we may talk over each other, but I just offer grace to that. That's what I wanted to say about that.
No, I appreciate that. I just interrupted you, see? So what I also appreciated about that, though, was that the comments that came up were about being sensitive to me, a white woman, not hogging the floor, which can happen so often. And so that we're getting more sensitivity to that, regardless of what our intention was or how it was in the long run. I'm just grateful that there's sensitivity to that kind of thing. And you and I were also joking around about what we do for a living is take charge. I mean, that's what both of us do, take charge of groups. So we were talking about how it's just kind of natural to, jump in and move in that way and all. But I appreciate what you're saying about, about us just giving grace to each other, about how that is. And I don't know how the balance will be today as we talk about these things, but it won't be coming out of an intended taking over by either one of us. I know that.
Awesome. So thank you. So you want to jump in with the questions that we kind of selected together? I know you had one that you wanted to start with.
Well, there's the one that you and I think we picked this out together because we're so aware that this is going on. And so I'm not going to quote it exactly because it's kind of long, but the idea of it is that for us white people who are wanting to make a conscious effort to connect with Black people or any people of color and feeling anxious because we don't know what to do. We don't know what will land well, what will be offensive, and all of this, and it can make us feel uncomfortable in a way that maybe we haven't felt before. I mean, it's certainly making us more conscious. But how do we negotiate this time where there's so much of that kind of change happening?
Right. And I am remembering a little bit more about that question. It was really about these intentional acts of kindness, which I just loved the way the question was framed. And if I can remember correctly, the participant was saying that they're intentionally reaching out and using those opportunities at the grocery store or at church or just out on a walk to, when they see a person of color, to have a conversation, to speak, and not a conversation about race or anything like that, but just to say good morning or how are you, or these were just these acts of kindness and reaching out and wondering if those would be welcomed or if it would feel awkward in some way. Was that the question that you're remembering as well?
Yeah, there were 3 or 4 that were around that particular issue.
Yes. Yeah. So what I wanted to say about that is that, because I have noticed that, honestly, as a Black woman in my community, I have noticed more folks either, speaking to me or just those acts of kindness have increased. And I personally felt really joyful about them. And I think that I imagine that they're coming out of a new awareness of how we haven't been doing that, right? There's an invisibility that I can experience when I'm out and about, of either not being seen or being seen, and that tension of not quite knowing how to greet me or how to connect with me can feel othering to me. So I've experienced those acts of kind of good morning, or you know, those acts of reaching out as just a recognition of our need to come back together more, if that makes sense. And I think that what I really wanted to say about that is that we are one community, right? This idea that we are separate is part of the systemic oppression that we're trying to dismantle as we kind of move forward. And so I see it as great. Like, we are one community, and we're starting to recognize that. It's one of the greatest ways we can really, on an individual level, disrupt the story that we're separate.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that that's lovely, and I feel good about it, partly because you're receiving more visibility, more being seen, more being acknowledged as a person. Because I know you've shared with me that invisibility is maybe the most painful part of just being kind of annihilated. So I think that's wonderful. From my white perspective, what I've experienced is myself sometimes holding back commenting on something to someone that in the past I might have said more easily, for fear of perhaps saying something that would be viewed in some way that I'm not intending. I know Joe and I were at a Starbucks one day, and there was a Black young woman who had the most beautiful tattoo. She was the barista down the back of her legs. And I wanted to just say, those tattoos are so gorgeous. And I found myself holding back a little bit, like, does that just cross some boundary and all of that? So I can also resonate with that hesitation that happens sometimes of wanting to be conscious, because I know I have a couple of other Black women who I'm friends with tell me how offended they are if someone says their hair is done beautifully.
Oh, hair. Yeah, that's different.
And I might feel like saying that, like, that is so beautiful. And so I think because I've had that experience with people I'm close to, I have this little hesitation inside me now that I know will change over time. And again, I think it's part maybe of becoming more conscious, becoming more aware that different people are going to have different responses. And can I still do what I would naturally do by way of recognition? And if somebody's unhappy with me about it, that they're free to express that, and I can make a repair about that and apologize. But I do feel the little hesitation sometimes. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, I think it is too, because it's the regularness of new relationship, right? Like new relationships are a dance of I don't know, and they're a dance of vulnerability, right? Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea when you're talking about community, there's a phrase that I love that I don't know if it began with John Lewis, but he spoke it so often, and that is beloved community. And there's another place I can feel a hesitation because I want to use those words, but am I taking them in my white mouth? Are they acceptable? And I don't know, but they sure are good in my heart.
Yeah. Beloved community. I love that. That for my first introduction to beloved community was some of the early writings of Dr. Martin Luther King. And this idea that a beloved community is a community where we all get to come together as our whole selves in our full humanity, each being seen as valuable and whole, and that in and of itself is a beloved community. And so I think that all of us get to hopefully walk into the energy of that and use those terms, I hope.
Yes, I hope too. again, I do think we talked about this a little bit last time, that's inherently who we are. We are intended to live like that. That at the core of our neurobiology is a movement toward that, and it just gets blocked off by all these traumas and all these patterns that get so implicitly ingrained in us. So I think in every heart, no matter how hurt it is and acting out at this point, there's still that yearning for that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So the meaning of safety was the other question that we selected to address this morning, and I think this one had to do with the difference between having POC, people of color gatherings and affinity groups versus gatherings where we have a multi-gendered, multiracial folks addressing the issue of racism. Is that accurate?
Let me read a few of the words, Vanessa, because I think it may help. It says, I found among clinicians the idea of neuroception of safety gets mixed up in the stark differences between what safety means for white allies, relational, emotional, versus for people of color, for Black people, relational, emotional, but also the physical dangers that are faced, and the different kinds of emotional danger. So how do we be in mixed groups while acknowledging that, I think was the intent.
And I also think it had a little bit to do with, and what came up for me as we were chatting about this was the idea, like personally, of feeling that my vulnerability, like my actual vulnerability as a Black woman, can be really threatened in ways that other people don't see, right? And so things that people say and the vulnerabilities and the risks that I take in a group when I'm trying to speak up, if it's a multiracial group, those risks are really different if I'm not just with other Black women, right? And so I think that there is this idea of the difference between being uncomfortable in a group and actually being unsafe in that environment. And so I feel like there's some tension in trying to figure out when I'm uncomfortable. Am I just uncomfortable here, or am I actually unsafe here? In this environment? And that for me as a Black woman, those answers are going to be really, really personal and really different depending on the risks that I'm taking.
Well, I would imagine, because in a way we can only partially sort that out in a cognitive way of am I uncomfortable or unsafe, because our nervous system isn't going to make that distinction quite. If there's enough discomfort, there's going to be a neuroception of I'm not safe, as there should be.
Absolutely.
And that nervous system is trying to protect us in every way possible all the time by telling us the truth about what's going on.
Right.
So I think in mixed groups, one of the things we could do that might be helpful is to actually have this be a topic of conversation. What is safety? How do you know it? When do you not feel safe? Rather than maybe some other kinds of things, at least to begin there and begin to get the sense of in each other of where that is right in this moment, in this particular group, or between this relationship. Because if we can talk about it, then even though I'm kind of locked inside my own white experience of safety, I can begin to step over a little bit more toward what you're experiencing if we can talk about levels of safety, right in that moment. Because I have come to appreciate very differently when and how you might feel unsafe, because from my white perspective, I perceive you as this strong, centered, brilliant woman. And until you and I began to talk about this more, the first thing in my mind would not have been, do you feel safe or not?
Yes.
I'm really grateful.
Thank you.
That we can have that conversation.
Yeah. And I think that you can be both and, right? I can be both strong and able and really not feel safe. And my body can, my heart can be racing, my tummy can be clenched. I can be feeling, wow, I'm taking big risk here. And so for me, I think that there's times when I can feel really engaged in multi-gendered, multiracial environments, but I never quite feel as safe as I feel when I'm surrounded by other Black women, right? That's home to me,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
And that's an experience I don't have. I can't remember a time, honestly, where I was a minority in a group in terms of race, color. But I don't know that experience in my body because that's not my lived experience day in and day out. And I guess one of my concerns also is if I'm feeling safe and I'm coming toward you like that, and you're not feeling safe, that could actually feel threatening.
Oh, I had not thought of that. Yeah.
Or if I'm feeling safe and you're not, and so you can't come toward me, I could feel alienated by that. I could feel like, did I do something wrong? Or so if we can have the conversation about what's happening in regard to that, then I think we can find a ground on which we can both stand.
Right. And just knowing that dynamic, that feeling, that felt sense of safety or unsafety is between us, right? Yeah. Just being aware that we're navigating this unseen, embodied reaction to one another as people, you in a white body, me in a Black body, just being able to know there's a inherited story between us. Yes. That tells us that we are different. And there's also an inherited story inside us that tells us we are the same. So how do we navigate that complexity? And I say we just navigate it with awareness, with knowing that we have inherited these stories between us and that we're trying to come into community with one another, into beloved community with one another.
Yes, and that the fearful places or the uncertain places are as welcome as the places that feel comfortable.
Absolutely, yeah, because that's how we really create relationship. That's really the rapport, is when those scary places can feel, we can recognize them in each other and just kind of smile and say, oh my gosh, we're both really, really afraid.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that probably all of us have little moments where we can cross over into a taste of the other's experience. I know when Joe and I walk down the street hand in hand, I'm kind of watching to see how people around us are responding to us being a couple.
Yes.
And some people
exactly.
smile and almost like acknowledge, and other people may look disgusted or turn away or whatever. So, but I don't live in it day in and day out like you do at all, Vanessa, but I have those moments.
Right, and you know that felt, that your body knows that experience. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit of it, absolutely.
We have a couple of more. Do we want to move on, or do we want to take the next couple and chat about those? What are you feeling?
I think I know you picked these two out, and I think maybe they felt important to you, and so we can maybe talk about them a little bit before we go on.
Yeah, let's just give it a little bit of time. And I particularly liked the one about how one of the participants wrote out a question about how to respond to specifically white clients who say they hate a victim mentality and are kind of using that term victim mentality to talk about how people of color of varied races are feeling about racism. Right, are feeling about that white supremacy that they're engaged with. And I thought that's really coming up a lot in my world, that idea that what rose in me as I read the question was, oh, I'm getting this question a lot in different ways. And it's coming up around, it feels kind of to me like, why don't they just get over it? Why are we still talking about race? That question kind of felt that way, not from the participant, but I know that that's what it felt like is the struggle is between why, why are we still talking about this? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it's, I mean, if I were having that conversation not as a therapist, the answer would be really simple. It's like, let's talk about what really happens and how we carry these things forward, But when in the therapeutic context, because I've been hearing this a lot from therapists that I consult with too, like, what do I do? Do I speak as an ally? How do I stay in my therapeutic role?
Yeah.
And all that kind of thing. And different therapists have different styles of working that may lend themselves to different ones. So all I can say is what happens for me when I hear this, which I have heard from 2 or 3 people saying something like that, and not even necessarily unkindly so much.
No. Yeah.
Why don't we just, that was a long time ago kind of thing.
Yes.
So what my way of working with that is to try to stay with where that person is in that moment, rather than going into needing to correct something or have a conversation, but to see what victim mentality means inside their own body. Because often either they've been accused of being a victim, or they're trying to stay away from any sense of how they really were victimized, and it's a protection. And if we can go into that in the body, and they can begin to touch their own intergenerational victimization, then I have the opportunity also to say, and I believe it's just like that in the Black community or the Native American community, that they too are carrying these wounds, and the victimization is still living in their bodies, because that's how it gets passed down, just like it's like, say, depression has come down through your family line to you.
Right.
So I may have the opportunity to say that, but as a therapist, I think I need to be with the person around what it means to them first, and stay in my therapist role. So that's how I'm being with it, because of the nature of the kind of deep internal work that my therapeutic style does. It seems like if we can get to their felt sense of how that lives in them, it's much easier for them to imagine it and sense it, that every human being is that way, that we're all carrying intergenerational legacies of pain that we deal with now in this moment, in this lifetime, even though it happened to our great grandfather or whatever.
Absolutely. And when I hear that question, not being a therapist myself, it's, what that feels like in my body is your whole self isn't welcome here, right? That your wound your wounds can show up, but only if they're healed, only if they feel comfortable, only if I can take it, without deep impact. So I think that it is kind of important to unpack the difference between, and I don't know what victim mentality means, like clinically what that means, but I want to feel like there's a big difference between my epigenetic embodied memory of oppression and enslavement and a victim mentality, right? Like that memory in my body, and all the ways it gets awoken and touched by a system, that says I'm not welcome, is real, and it's present, and it's real in that moment. It's not from the past anymore, if that makes sense. It feels really, really present and really solid and really real in that moment.
Yes, yeah, and I believe that this is true for every human being, is that we are carrying those impacts. We're carrying the beautiful positive things that were passed down implicitly, that come into our body through epigenetics and implicit memory, and we're carrying these wounds as well. And so I think people that talk about victim mentality often have been accused of being a victim, and so they want to step away from that, or it's a way to not, like I said earlier, people will defend in any way possible from feeling like I was little and victimized, or I was victimized in this way. And so if I can criticize it and push it down inside me, I don't have to touch my own pain around the ways things have happened to me. And then it turns around though and becomes cruelty toward you and disowning of you, Vanessa.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then at that point you're into systemic kinds of racism where, you know, you guys get over it, you know, that was a long time ago, and why should we give you reparations, and why should you not just move forward in your life? And boy, we could go into the history of how impossible that has been, no matter what you've done. You know, we could talk about that. That's not what we're talking about today, but but I know I have to walk a fine line inside myself between wanting to speak those kinds of words and being able to be with the person in the way that maybe they get the felt sense of why they say that.
Yes.
Well, that maybe they can feel it differently.
Yeah. So I think it's just letting us really have that deep memory that whatever is rising is now, right? It is now. And so whatever it is, if we can just remember that in our bodies, that whatever is rising before us for healing is now, and because it is now, it's a really wonderful opportunity to move it forward and to heal. Like it may be about something inherited or a story we carry about something we inherited, but if it's rising, it's now, and it is an opportunity to heal it. Right.
You say you're not a therapist, but actually you're a great therapist, Vanessa.
Some of my best friends are therapists, Bonnie. Thank you. So we want to kind of move into our topic, I think, now, which is that complexity of how.
Before we go there, I just thought we'd pause for a second and see if any other questions came in while we were talking about those things, just for a second. So,
perfect.
Joe, do you have anything?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Joe.
That's what I'm muting.
So there have been several expressions of appreciation as you started out for the topics that you addressed coming forward from the last meeting. So they appreciated your speaking to the unconscious racism issue, to the balance of sharing issue, and the neuroception of safety issue. I find myself wanting to consolidate questions because that's what happens inside my head. But the neuroception of safety issue was something that a couple of comments made me wonder if it would be helpful to say a little bit more about what does that mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Bonnie, can you? That's your language, Bonnie.
Well, one of the things we've learned through the work of a man named Steve Porges is how very sensitive our nervous systems are below the level of conscious awareness, surveying millisecond by microsecond, whether our system as a whole feels safe or not safe. And it's made up of what's coming in from the outside and what's arising within us. And so that before it ever becomes aware to the point where I can say, oh, I'm feeling scared, my system has already adjusted to a knowing that's before conscious awareness. And so that's when, when we were talking, Vanessa, about discomfort versus really fear, how neuroception is probably going to pick up both of those as something scary is happening here.
Oh, I can definitely speak to that. Like walking into a room, as a Black woman, oftentimes, and I don't know if there's other Black women on the call who can kind of speak to this as well or have questions about this as well, but I often walk into these rooms and I'm the only Black woman in the room, you know, and I'm the presenter, or you know, I'm the executive director, you know, I'm walking in as me. But I can feel sometimes when I first walk into those spaces, this like desire to withdraw. I don't know how else to describe it, but this pulling in. And then I breathe, I'll look for comforting faces, I'll pull up, you know, my inner allies. I have lots of folks who are just so dear to me, and I'll kind of pull them up, but all in such a split second that I don't even know I'm doing it. But soon my system has relaxed and I can enter that space. And that all happens so fast that I'm just now being able to talk about it or give language to it.
That's right. And by the time you've become aware of this pulling back, neuroception happened before that, and let your system know that you wanted to fight or flee. And so that little pulling back is a flight response, in response to how the neuroception is informing your system to keep it safe. I mean, it's always adaptive. It's always adaptive when that happens. And it's really quite remarkable. So hopefully that helps to clarify a little bit. And also, I'm always in awe of how our systems take care of us. I'm just in awe.
Amazing.
Yeah. Thank you. That was such a perfect way to talk. I mean, to give that concrete.
Yeah, I have felt that. Yeah, that has happened for me. Yeah.
Well, and part of what you all are saying, one point that occurs to me is that the neuroception or the experience of safety is always a moving target.
Yes.
So it's not like I feel safe for this whole meeting. It's like I feel safe in this instance, but in the next instance, I may not.
Yeah.
And then I may again.
That's right. It's very true.
Yeah. One person's made a comment about the danger of a single story and the assumption that if we hear from one person of color saying this is what it's like to be a person of color, that we can't generalize that to everybody.
Not at all. Yeah.
And that linked to a participant who's writing in about being an adopted parent of a multiracial family. So they have multiple children from multiple different ethnic backgrounds. And as they sit at the dinner table with all of these different ethnicities represented within the family, wondering how to talk to these youngsters about what's happening in the world, because within the family, there's an experience of everybody belongs and we're all part of this beloved community. And then there's this confusion about why in the world are people behaving the way they are.
Yeah, I'm so glad, Joe, that you mentioned that about speaking, you know, for yourself as opposed to speaking for all people of color. And I think that it's one of the huge challenges of being a person of color, or specifically for me, a Black woman, is one of the privileges of whiteness is you get to be individuals, right? And that, you know, as Black people, even though we are as individual as, you know, as anyone else, people often will perceive when I'm speaking for me that I'm speaking for my whole community, but I'm always speaking for me, right? I'm sharing my experience with these stories. So I just offer that. It's something Bonnie and I chatted a lot about when we were first talking about this, is how do we really make sure that we do just speak for ourselves. So I am so deeply appreciative of that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yep.
Did you have anything to add, Bonnie?
Well, no, just what you said was what was in my mind too, is how important it is that people know this is a really personal conversation, and not all women or all white women are going to have this experience at all. But what we hope is that because we're talking experientially, that all of you, anybody here or whoever hears this, will drop down into being curious about what their own experience is.
Yeah. And I, you know, I think I don't really know yet what the specific question was about the dinner table and folks coming together. Was the question how to talk about that, or how to?
Yes, it was. So I can read you part of it.
Okay.
Do you have any recommendations of how to talk to children who are different ethnicities and cultures, who are pretty much, quote, unaware of their differences? Maybe unaware isn't the right word, but when we explain what is happening, they can't understand why it is happening.
Oh, yeah, that's so beautiful. The vision of children, my grandchildren, I have 2 grandsons, and I have had to talk to them about race for the first time. They're very young, and it's just, children see humanity, right? It's hard to talk to them about this because that's not their experience of the world. They're experiencing other people as just other people, and my grandsons do. So I struggle with it too. I don't have any answers. I just know as a grandmother that has been a constant struggle. I have to say that for me, it's been a painful one too, to have to talk to my grandchildren about race when they're so innocent and wide-eyed and curious about the world. Some of the events that have happened in the world have forced these conversations in ways that are just deeply painful. That's what I have to say.
Yeah. I don't know that I have anything of value to add at all, except that I think that this conversation, depending on the ages of the children, has to really take into account developmentally where they are, that having a conversation with a 12-year-old is really different than having a conversation with a 4-year-old about what they see, and that ultimately probably also listening to them and really encouraging them to speak to what their confusions and what their experiences are is really helpful for them to be heard deeply about how this is for them. When you were talking, Vanessa, about your grandkids, one image that came to me is how often I will see white people be charmed by children of color, only to turn around and be absolutely dismissive or whatever of the adults. So I think often kids also have a different experience in the world, especially little kids have a different experience.
Yes, very much so. Yes, very much so.
Than teenagers or adults do. So it's even more confusing.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But I feel so grateful for your dinner table is what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I feel grateful for your dinner table.
Yeah.
And you had time for one more?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as long as we don't talk about it.
Well, don't get too long-winded. There's a participant writing in who is a person of mixed race herself, and asking if you have any comments about the percentage or what the experience would be of epigenetic memory if you're drawing from 2 different racial lines.
I'm sorry, Bonnie, that's a Bonnie. I just don't understand. Yeah.
I mean, I understand the question, but I don't think we have anything close to an answer at this point epigenetically about how all that will happen, although there is certainly a lot to be said about the maternal line being the most direct epigenetic transmission through the grandmother that we know at this point. That doesn't mean stuff isn't coming from the father too, but it comes about in a different way, and we're just beginning to explore that. Maybe the question that we can understand more at this point is implicitly what have we taken on through one parent's line, like what was the relational and racial and all that history and experience of, say, mom and then dad, and knowing that those 2 definitely meet and interact inside of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think there's a lot of conversation in the Black community about like how our lived experiences are different based on how dark or light you are as a Black person. And so I've often wondered about that in the epigenetic story as well. It's like how much of my experiences as a Black woman are epigenetic, and how much are based on that I live in a dark-skinned Black body.
Yes.
And that my lived experience is shaped by that. And so I carry that question as well. So I can appreciate the question, wish I had a deeper answer.
Well, it's probably very individual for each person too. You know, just our inheritance from a mother and a father are going to be different. I mean, if we just think of parents coming from two cultures, even in a white body, you're going to get some really different inputs from both sides. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Jo.
Yes.
See you soon.
Okay.
So Bonnie, do you want to start kind of just checking in about what we really hoped to share with folks today about, you know, that complicated web of our personal experiences and how it meets the systemic white supremacy that surrounds us as individuals, and how that shapes the way we move through the world.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I'm going to dive in here first to talk about some of my experiences with people of various ethnicities and colors as a kid and growing up, and how, while in the midst of living in the systemic racism of growing up in a very waspy community for my whole life. So all of those pieces, but then also I have all these unique experiences that are just mine, that nobody else had, because they're just what it was like for me. So as I talk about this also, what I hope is that all of you listening will begin to check back in with what were your experiences with people of this, like maybe almost nothing, or maybe some really, you know, powerful, impactful experiences that you might have had, and how you can't separate out these different levels of experience because they just play around with each other. And then I love the word intersectionality. And then there's also the intersection with our own trauma history too. I mean, the level of complexity is something where you can't say this is how it works, because it's just way too complex. But it's been really helpful for me since we decided to do this, Vanessa, to actually go back and reflect on what my interactions were, starting with the Black people that were in my sphere as a child. And what I'm finding is the longer I think about it, the deeper I'm beginning to be touched by what this was actually conveying to me. It's not just a factual story, but that there is something in there that is really vital for me to understand. And that probably others may have had some similar or very different experiences, but the act of reflecting on them is really deepening my sense of their importance. If I just think about it as like, oh yeah, this happened and that happened, not much happens. But when I keep going back and going back, something happens.
Oh yeah.
So my first 7 years, I grew up in Pasadena, California. There was probably some mixture of people living there, but honestly, the trauma level in our family was such, I wasn't doing anything but fighting for survival. So I don't have any memories that come back to me from that time about anything except that experience. But then when I was 7.5, we suddenly went from being quite poor to being like almost upper middle class through a change in my father's circumstances. And we now moved into up the hill, interestingly enough, to La Cañada, which was about as white a community as you can imagine. And from there through junior high, all the way through junior high up till high school, I had very little interaction with people of any any other ethnicity, except that we had a Black maid.
Mhm. Yeah.
And my main memory of her that prior to really reflecting on how this was that when I was in junior high, a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover got passed around because of the sex scenes in it, and those pages were marked, and each girl would pass it on to the next girl, and I tucked it in between my mattress. We decided that's where we'd hide it from our parents, and Ella, our maid, found it and gave it to my mother, so I developed an abiding dislike for her as a result of that. So for me, that was the piece of the story that resonated. But then I began to really sit with what it was like. And what I can feel is how my parents felt good because they allowed her to eat at the dinner table with us. And how they felt good because she got some of my mother's cast-off clothing. And how they felt good about those things. And it makes my stomach hurt right now. And it feels to me at this point like a scene out of Gone with the Wind. And how much I actually liked that movie back when I first saw it. You know, I didn't understand the history at all, but it doesn't leave the way my parents treated her with this kind of superior kindness just makes me feel sick now when I think about it. So that was one experience that I had that is getting a chance to really be transformed now with reflection and sitting with it.
Because it changes as you look back, as you look at it with new awareness,
Right.
new stories. Yes.
Yes. So I went off to there was no high school in our community. And so we were bused into Pasadena to go to John Muir High. And all of a sudden I was in a mix of Black, probably about a third of the students were Black, probably maybe a quarter were Asian. I know there were some Hispanic kids, but I don't feel much connection to my experience with them, but I do very much to the Asian kids and the Black kids. Mm-hmm. And then there were us white kids, some of which were from Pasadena, but a lot of us were coming in from our extremely waspy, whatever. Before we went there, we were told by somebody at our junior high who was kind of prepping us to go there to be very careful because the Black girls in particular were dangerous and would carry those beehive hairdos that we all were wearing back then, and that they carried knives and that and would steal our lunch money, and that we shouldn't walk the halls alone. Mm-hmm. It just breaks my heart. Mm-hmm. And I was a very timid, traumatized kid, so it just scared the pee out of me. I mean, it was just really frightening. And they said, be grateful you're not riding with them on the bus. You know, it was all white bus. Yeah. So I'm beyond saddened and horrified. And again, I think the intention of the teacher that shared that with us was one of protection and all of that. But it is not my experience that was true. But I was scared. I would walk the halls alone.
Yeah. And it's really, it's kind of in alignment with when we talked last couple of weeks ago about that history, right? It's the beware, the dehumanizing of those kids, those children.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. So I had that input. So then what I observed actually happened was every day after school, the Black kids went off to one end of the parking lot, and the white kids were over here where they had parked their cars. The Asian kids disappeared, and I don't know what the Hispanic kids did. The Asian kids were like gone. And the Black kids would get into fights, and the white kids would get into fights, but not with each other. There was a complete segregation that happened. It happened around lunch. It happened after school. And somehow they would get into tussles or fights or whatever, but it was equally white and black, but they were not with each other. And Bettina has a blog where, I don't know if you got a chance to read it, where when she brought home chickens, she brought home some chickens that were from the same flock. Some were black and some were white, and they self-segregated.
Huh.
And then as they nurtured safety, they would roost differently. The black ones roosted together and the white ones roosted together. And as Bettina and her crew cultivated safety and helped, because chickens get really scared, and she said they do the squatty behavior when they're scared, and as they nurtured them back into safety, they mingled.
Wow.
So I think everybody was scared. I think that's what the separation was about. Everybody was scared. I don't know what the black kids were being told about the white kids. I don't know.
Right.
So I had that experience. But then the culminating experience for me was, I'm a terrible athlete, but I can really pitch a softball. And so I was part of the Girls Athletic Association softball team. And my teammate, I had a black teammate who actually you look a little bit like. It's really kind of amazing. And I had a really good bond with her, and we both ran for treasurer of GAA, and she won, and that was fine. So the year I wanted to have a party at my house and have my team come to the party. And my parents said, there is no way a black girl is coming to this house. What would the neighbors think? Of course, we had a black maid, but that's entirely different, right?
Yes.
So probably in my one real act of bravery, I said, then the party's not happening, because if Juanita can't come, I'm not doing it. So what I learned from all of this is that for me, having the personal relationship with her changed everything for me about how I was experiencing Blackness, but it didn't completely erase my fear of the rest of it. It didn't break down, and we were in class together and all of that kind of thing. But again, the black kids generally sat together unless we were in alphabetical order. And in that case, they didn't. Black and white hardly mixed at all, except on the sports field for both the girls and the boys. And that gave me the opportunity to develop a living relationship in proximity and discover that we were just, girls together playing softball and could really like each other. She was really funny too. And I was really timid, and I actually felt somewhat kind of protected by her some way. I don't know quite what that was. There was just something about her warmth and caring that really helped me in what was a difficult time. And I think she really liked me too. I mean, we just kind of, kidded around together. So what a varied bunch of inputs. And then after that, just to finish kind of my experiences, just another piece of it is every single black person that I had much closeness with after that was a person of similar education and similar socioeconomic status. And I feel like I've had some of those really good relationships. I went to Occidental College. Our student body president was Baltimore Scott, a black man, a black guy. And we also had kids from Africa that were in our dorm and everything so I had those relationships. And then professionally, all my relationships, like with you and others, have been like that. And I'm really grateful for that, because I do feel a real comfort. But here's the part that makes me so sad, Vanessa, is it's also given me permission to not be curious about what your experience specifically is as a black woman until very recently. Because if I'm okay, because we're up here at this stage, I think you're okay too.
Yeah.
And that sense of our commonality actually took away that impulse to ask, like, being a black woman, what is your experience like, say, in this group that we're in together?
Exactly.
So, we've talked about that before, and I think I've made amends for my total lack of awareness.
Right. I mean, well, I think part of that is what we're talking about, where this you're sharing your personal history, and I'm curious about how you see that connecting with the white supremacy culture, where it is that more systemic oppression.
Right. Well, and I think that last piece I said is partly how it connects to it, is that my assumption that everybody's like me. You know, that my experience, if I'm having a good experience and we're similar, then you must be too, you know, that we're just, and so to not even, it gives me the privilege of not even asking the question of you, of not feeling into your experience, of being unconscious of the other people around me. I mean, you and I might be looking at each other with love, but I'm not looking around and sensing that other people might not be treating you well. I'm not curious about it. I'm not even thinking about it. I don't have, my perceptions are not attuned in a way that takes in your whole experience.
Right.
And part of that, it's not because I don't want to. It's because I don't, because that's the way the system is.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. As part of that is that when we look at all of that, we challenge the system that is trying to tell us constantly that everything is okay. There's nothing broken here. You know, it's all fine.
Right. And I have the evidence because you and I are doing great together, right?
Right.
So then I completely don't see the rest of it, or I see it briefly. I mean, like, you know, I was certainly well aware of back in college days of the civil rights kind of thing. I was busy protesting against the war in Vietnam. I was too scared to go to Mississippi, or I probably might have. But even then, I don't know how deeply I would have taken it in. I really don't know, with with this white lens, how deeply I've taken in the day-to-day way that the entire system is stacked against thriving.
Yes. And I think it's so interesting as I'm listening to your story, how the outer world, the movies, you know, what the teachers say, all that structure, external structure, is in alignment with those experiences. And my experience is completely different. What's happening inside my body and the way the world around me is organized are never in alignment.
Right.
Right? It's just the constant me going, but what about this or what about that? Yeah. So that's interesting to me.
It is. And also systemically, I'm sure that these things that we were told before we went off to John Muir High School, that was part of that whole systemic thing too. I don't know that anything we were told actually had any factual basis, but was part of the system of, these are dangerous people and you should stay away from them.
Right. Yeah, that really resonated with me as you were telling it. I'm like, wow, how consistent that is with the history that even came 100, 200 years before you even got to that moment of that person standing before those children and giving them this story about these other children, based on nothing but the systemic racism that is structured around it. It's just interesting.
Well, it is. And I'm a 14-year-old traumatized child who's already scared to death to get on a bus and go across town. Right. And now I'm being given this in a way that I don't have any way to dispute it. I don't have anything to bring to the table at all. So now when I get there, I am conveying to the Black girls my fear of them, which in no way makes it possible to come together at all.
No.
And they're probably scared of me and the entire system anyway, because of everything they've experienced. So we don't have a chance to meet until I have this time when we're actually doing something together.
So Bonnie, you're frozen
together that allows us to discover each other.
There's a little freeze there.
Well, I think we're unfrozen. Are we okay now? Okay, yeah. But just saying, we didn't get a chance until I met my friend on the softball team. There was absolutely nothing within the system that allowed us to do this kind of connecting. It's built into the system that we have to be afraid of each other and move away from each other into protection. And it's
yeah, and I think that there's a way that's intentional, right? That the system is very much structured to keep the separateness and the story of otherness in place.
Yes. And it's been in place for so long that it's gone underground at this point as just the ground we're standing on. It isn't something we're having conversation about or questioning. It's what is. And that's what, there was a question earlier about how trauma becomes culture. And this is a good example. You know, the traumas that initiated this in the beginning have now become the systemic culture of who we are to each other.
That's so true. And I think it also speaks to how beloved community and friendship are acts of revolution, right? Yeah. They disrupt those stories of separateness and otherness and dehumanization. That friendship and that idea of building beloved community are really profound acts of revolution when the story is so destructive as what we're talking about.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, they really are. And again, just from, it feels to me like John Lewis got this in his bones. And he would take a really, really long time, but he knew that it had to move in that direction eventually. And Martin Luther King Jr. too. But I don't know, there's something about little John Lewis's tenacity and ferociousness that really grabs me about the hopefulness of it being where we must go.
Right, and the concept that trouble can be good trouble, right? That love is good trouble, protest is good trouble, speaking out when you are afraid, telling the truth is good trouble, right? Yeah. This idea that trouble can be in the act of goodness, an act of rebellion is just wonderful. I love it too.
Yeah, me too. So I wanted to talk about my experience with the Asian kids for just a minute, because I'm gonna, Bettina, I'm gonna send you a link, and I think I sent it to you, Vanessa, for something called the Racism Daily, or the Antiracism Daily. It's a very short newsletter, and if anybody wants to just get some viewpoint on some aspect of this, and then some action points, and on, there's something called Study Hall on Saturday. It's short, it's concise, really valuable. So when I was thinking about my response to the Asian kids that were part of our community in high school, it just happened to be that they were writing about this kind of thing in that. So that's why I wanted to spend a minute on this. Okay. So the cultural belief definitely in the school was as the Asian kids were the smartest kids. There was just no doubt about it. So relative to them, I always felt stupid, even though I was a good student. And I felt a little distant from them because of that, because I always felt so inferior to these Asian kids who, again, came to school, did what they did, and they just vanished at the end of the day. They were gone. But one of the harms that's happened to the Asian community is that myth that that's what it is to be an Asian person. And they wrote about it in there in terms of the stereotype of you will be the best employee or the best student or the best whatever because you're Asian, and that there is absolutely no room to be a human being within that. There's no room for variety. There's no room for a kid who struggles. There's no room for anything except to be seen in this stereotypical way. So even to be seen as better than everybody else is really injurious, just for what you said, because there is absolutely no room for an individual's experience as a human being.
Yeah.
So that just really touched me, because I could feel how cemented that was back in 1956. that was already set in stone at that school.
Oh yeah, I think the stories of white supremacy and of difference and othering are destructive to every one of us in these systems in different, very unique and different ways. We're not all having the same experience, but we're all having an experience that limits our full expression as full humans, individual, beautiful, flawed humans, right?
Yes, absolutely. So I would just, again, just am so, I feel so happy to be being guided by this time to go back into my own history and to really keep going back, like day after day, like every day since we decided to do this, I go back and sample different periods of time and different relationships and all of that, and then feel how they were sometimes truncated or cut off because of white supremacy, because of the system, and I couldn't move in. Like in high school, I could not move in very much to community with anybody but the white kids. I might as well still have been in La Cañada, you know, as far as as far as that, except for that one sports experience. And so it's just really helping me to feel out the dimensions of how these two things come together, the system and what my personal experiences have been. So Joey, are there any questions burning right now about this? And then we'll go from there.
Well, there are questions, again, some of them are coming in as comments. There were a couple of questions that came in about about the circumstance of being a counselor. So one person asked Vanessa, they had the impression that you had done counseling with, I think they had the impression that you had done counseling with Bonnie as your therapist, and they wanted to know how you sought out a counselor. I mean, I thought the question was still interesting because they said, what helped you to go as a Black woman to seek a white counselor? And maybe paired with that, there was a comment from a Black therapist saying that sometimes when he is sitting with a white client who has conspicuous white fragility, he gets very activated and has difficulty being in the same room with this person. He doesn't feel safe. So maybe that issue of Black-white counseling is something that you can speak to.
Well, Bonnie has not been my counselor. Bonnie's been my teacher and friend. I'm an advocate, a domestic violence advocate, so I work in a therapeutic way with lots and lots of clients, primarily around trauma. But I do have a counselor, and she is white. She's a white woman, and I was really looking for a Black counselor. But I wanted someone who had a deep understanding of trauma. And so I'm in Vancouver, Washington. There wasn't a Black counselor available, but I've only been in counseling about 8 months. And I just adore her, and it's been a really beneficial, lovely experience. So I can speak to that, but Bonnie hasn't been my counselor.
Yeah.
So Bonnie, did you want to speak to the other part of the question, or do you want me to address that a little bit?
Why don't you address that a little bit, since it's from a Black...
I just really can relate to that. I mean, that has happened to me over my 33-year career as an advocate working with trauma survivors. That has happened numerous times. Like, there's such resonance in that experience for me. And I can say, how do I navigate that? Because I work with my body a lot. Like when that kind of rises, I try to just kind of expand my capacity to hold both of those things for me and the participant in front of me, right? I'm aware of my own activation and just try to make room for what we're both experiencing in that moment. Like, not in a way that I'm speaking, but in a way that I'm holding space for more room. I kind of experience that as, oh, my container isn't big enough to hold what's happening now. Let me widen that. Let me make more space so that I can hold the complexity of what we are both experiencing here.
And I would just say one other thing is, I think when I have those experiences around other kinds of issues where I'm really touched in some way and something wakes up, what I think is the most important thing for me to do is to then get support and have somebody really hear me about how this was for me, so that my system can metabolize that experience in the care of another.
Yes.
I really need to be heard. And then my system will probably be more fully able to settle.
Yeah, and it's just something that I really talk about with other advocates and with other folks who are doing therapy. I think I know as a Black practitioner, it's an extremely common experience for me to have.
Okay. Another couple of comments came in, or questions about this divergence around how Black people will get responded to as a group or representative of a group, and white people get seen more individually. And can you say anything more about how that affects the efforts to try and talk to each other?
Yeah, I think, and I'm about to talk a little bit more about my personal history, but I know that, as people of color, and I have had this conversation with Native folk, other women of color. I'm part of a women of color community, so we talk about these things often, and it is one of the risks that I think I experience that as a risk, right? When I'm in community, I know I'm just me. I'm Vanessa, and I'm just one flawed whole human, but I am never unaware of how my actions impact my entire community. It's something I carry in my bones. And so I think it affects everything. Yeah, I think I do. I think it affects everything. And no matter how much I kind of try to tell myself I'm just me, I'm always carrying the responsibility and accountability to my community. It's part of Black culture to move as a community, as a tribe, and I carry that. I inherited that, and it's in my body. Bonnie, what would you say about that?
I was really trying to feel into my body how that is for me. I mean, as I hear you say that, part of me feels really warmed by what you say, the way that the community feels for each other, and that my experience as a white woman is that is not very true for white people, and I feel like that's a loss. But I also hear the pressure that is all the time. That is terrible to have to bear that much. And I was kind of thinking, do I feel? It's an odd thing. I don't feel what you feel like that. I don't feel responsible for other white people. What I do feel is a responsibility to be a decent human being on behalf of mankind, which is a different thing, and it doesn't put any pressure on me. But it doesn't feel like it's just for me. I mean, it feels to me like who I am in the world matters in some spiritual way, but I don't feel any of that pressure that you feel like I'm responsible for a community. And
Absolutely. One of the ways it really shows up that I can kind of give an example of is in the media, right? If a Black man does something, it becomes about all Black men and all Black men's behavior. But if a white man does something, it becomes about that person's mental health, their community, how they were raised. It becomes about that person. And so that's one of the ways to kind of see that manifest in the context of the whole white supremacy culture. Yeah.
And it takes me, when you're saying that, it takes me back to how it has then impacts that move down from there too, because again, that anti-racism, the daily thing, they were also talking about how women of color are so much less likely to report rape or likely to report child abuse.
Yes.
Because they're afraid of what the system will do to the men in the community. Not just their man, but the men in the community.
Yes.
All the men in the community. And so they don't, yeah.
Well, I can say that my experience as an advocate says that's very true. I've sat with hundreds and hundreds of survivors of color, and I've heard that countless times. Yeah.
Okay.
Makes me very sad.
Yeah.
Also determined.
Yeah. I bet. That's true.
Anything more, Joe?
So one other comment about wanting to address the importance of responding to being called out for potential unconscious bias or racism, or taking over spaces to learn to not point to our intentions as a way of defending our own fragility, versus recognizing the calling out as is about potential unconscious perpetuation of racism. I don't know if that's entirely clear, but trying to speak to, I think, the importance of lifting our level of consciousness about when racism is operative.
Mm-hmm. And there was something about, wasn't there something about white fragility, white fragile responses in there, or did I just make that up right now?
Oh, that was there. That was there.
Yeah, I mean, again, to me, this is so complex. Because if I've experienced a lot of shaming in my trauma history, anybody who says anything to me is probably going to touch that wound in me. And I can respond in a whole variety of ways around that. So sometimes it doesn't have to do with the present moment. It has to do with the traumas that I'm carrying. That does not in any way say that that then means that you as my Black friend are responsible for making me feel better, but it could make, but it could make you feel responsible for making you feel better. Because what I've come to understand is that the making white people feel better is how you didn't die back from slavery onward. By making white people feel okay, you get to live. So to me, it's a really complex thing, because I can't be completely able to just shut down my response if I've had a lot of shaming and then I hear from somebody that hurt my feelings or just gets angry at me. I can't necessarily help my implicit response to it. So I do think it gets very, very complex. But since we started this journey, I don't know, 5-6 months ago now, of really trying to do all of this, what I've been trying to cultivate is joy in having it pointed out to me if I've done something. To cultivate, like, thank you. I don't want to hurt you. I didn't mean to hurt you, but to cultivate, like, thank you. Thank you for telling me. Even if you're telling me and you're mad at me, thank you, because I don't want to continue to hurt you. But that means I have to somehow get past the shame piece enough to be able to do that. It's just, again, it's so complex inside of us, what we carry, and how we respond is not in our conscious control all of the time. But I do think we can cultivate something more resilient about this, where we're trying to do it. I actually struggle more with being called out by a white person than I do someone of color. I actually welcome it with people of color, not so much with white people. And that's something I need to investigate some more.
Well, what this brings up for me, Bonnie, is this idea, I do a lot of anti-racism work with white allies. Like these are women who I've been in the trenches with. Like we have done anti-racism training together. We have cried together. We have struggled, been terrified together. And so one of the things that I'm just remembering one of my white allies saying to me, my God, we just have to be able to sit in the, I'm not going to say her exact words because she said it differently, but I'm going to say, but we have to be able to sit in the messy fire of it, right? We have, that idea that if we're really going to change this, it is not going to look good, feel good, be pretty. It's not going to smell good. This is going to be a huge mess. And it's going to be a scary mess, an overwhelming mess. And how do we sit together in the fire of that and realize that that mess is our inheritance. And we don't want to send it down the line, right? So it's ours to kind of face and deal with. And I think that, the way she said it was different, but it really was so touching to me because I realized that that person was a warrior, right? They're with me then. Because I can't get out of the fire, right? I can't walk away from the mess. I don't have choices about that. I'm in it. But for white allies to join in the real mess of it is really nourishing. But some people just kind of stand on the edges, and that's great, that's fine, but it's different than being in the middle of it with me. And I think the middle of it is where this person's kind of talking about. It's that scary, raggedy place.
And it's held together by something bigger at the bottom, isn't it, of what matters and what's important, that's mutually held, that there's something that the platform on which that messiness can rest that gives it meaning and value.
Yeah.
Feels like to me anyway, when you talk about it.
But there is a way that we're all going to be vulnerable there, right? That place is very, very tender.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
So Bonnie, I'm going to talk a little bit about my history and kind of call in my ancestors to share with you kind of what they want to. And, when I thought about, how does, as a Black woman, as Vanessa, as, how have my people navigated the complex web of white supremacy as individuals, and what has the impact been on them, and what is it on me? And so the first story that rose for me, because I come from storytellers, but the first story that rose in me was the story of leaving Texas, right? And this happened prior to my birth. I can talk about my experience, but as a Black woman, it's hard to do it without talking about my people, to go back and grab them. But my mom and my dad left a place called Hooks, Texas, and moved to Washington State. And what I know about that move that they made is that it was made after a period of great fear and oppression. They had been in an environment where it was very closed. Everyone was family, right? It's a small town. It's Hooks, Texas. It's right outside of Texarkana, close to, I think, Arkansas. But it's a very small community. I mean, one of the first African-American churches was built there by the enslaved ancestors. And There's a major river, there's black walnut forest, and this was really an environment that is described to me as almost like an Eden, you know, everyone together, farming, growing, living, building their own schools, their own communities. Well, around the time my parents were married, that changed, and other white people and different people started to move in, and the Native people and the Black people started to move out of the area a little bit. And so there was this huge migration out of Texas and into the northern territories for looking for more safety. And that's what happened for my parents. They took that journey. But what I felt in their bodies was this longing for the safety of community. And that was the community that they left, right? I could just feel it in them. There was this longing for that, you know? And I think of it in terms, for me, you know, they went from what felt like danger to what they were perceiving was going to be safety, but they actually went from danger to more danger, because Washington and Oregon brought isolation and otherness that they had never known before, right? They just had never experienced that level of isolation or that level of otherness. Every face they saw was family in Hooks, Texas. And so I just remember that fear. You know, when I think about my parents, that fear in their bodies of being in this really stark environment of Oregon and Washington was palatable for me. I was born into that. And I just remember my mom just always needing to keep me safe. Like, for us, the house was the safest place to be, right? Like, in those walls, it was almost like they created hooks inside the house, right? So that's the first story. And I remember when my grandmother would come from Texas to Washington, where I was born, she would say things like, you know, don't let that baby go outside, you know, you know, she had the same fear. There was this idea that if you didn't look like me, if you were not family, and family to me as a Black woman is any other Black person who happened to be in the community. So it's biological family, but also just family, you know, where we were. Her idea was, if you go outside of that, my grandmother was terrified of white people. I mean, literally terrified of them. And she wouldn't say it, but you would feel it by the grip of her hand, tightly, the pull of her grabbing you to her body, you know, and her just kind of stiffening and being like, you know, she was ready. What's coming at my grandbaby? Right? And it would just be another person walking down the street. And I never fully understood it, but I learned it in my body, right? This embodied. How does racism, that systemic oppression, impact me as an individual? The first impact is fear, right? This world isn't made for you, and you are not welcomed here, right? That's the first message, right? So I start with that migration, that journey. The second story that's rising for me is a story of going back from Washington to Texas. And we would go every year. And my parents, I'm one of like 8 kids. So we had this huge rambling station wagon. And my parents would throw all of us kids, you know, this is before seatbelts, so, you know, you might have a feeling about that, because we'd just be piled into that thing. And as one of the younger ones, I'd be in the way back, which I love, because I could, you know, sleep and eat food. And, you know, my sisters were always taking care of me. They still do that. So I'd be all comfy. And we would make this trip from Washington to Texas. But at some point on the journey, and I wish I had my siblings here because they're older than me and could tell us where we were. But on some point on the journey, the car would be filled with fear. It would just be filled with it. I could feel that we had moved into an environment that was very different. My parents didn't say anything about this, but my dad, we would all have to lay completely flat, and we'd have blankets covering us like we were not in the car. And they would move slowly, right? And we would try to find a safe place to rest. My dad would tell us, we're gonna go into, I'm gonna get food. And I'd say, oh, can I go use the bathroom? Or can I go in and get some candy? And he'd say, no, baby, we are just gonna go to the back and we're gonna ask the man if there's enough room for such a big family. You know, we're so many kids, we're gonna see if there's room for all of us to eat in there. And there never was. But what I learned as an adult was we were moving through those white-only territories and places where Black people couldn't, you know, I was born in '62. So Black people couldn't go in and get a drink of water. We couldn't get food. My dad had to find white allies, or there was no feeding his kids. And so we would do this journey and get to Texas, and then everything would be different. So I think that memory of just fear as you move through the world is one of the most impactful things about white supremacy for me personally, was just this idea, and I'm such a sensitive person, I could feel my parents' fear, I could feel the fear of the journey back and forth. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I was starting to put that into the context of white supremacy. But first, I just learned to be afraid, right? So, yeah. So I just start with that story. I think the other thing, I knew I wanted to say something else. Let me see what it was. I got into my story. But I will let you just sit with that for a minute while I feel for the next story that wants to rise. So the next story that wants to rise is the story of being seen, right? So one of the things that my earliest days as a kid, I went to public school, Martin Luther King Elementary School here in Vancouver, Washington, East 13th Street. And when I went to school, I already knew how to read. You know, I was 4 or 5, but my mom was an avid reader. I love books. Books were home to me. They still are. I just love them. And so when I got to school, I knew how to read. And I wanted to tell my teacher that, because she had these the letters were kind of circling the room, and she was trying to teach them to me. And I thought this was crazy. Like, I know A, B, C, D, E, R. So I tried to tell her that, and she yelled at me, punished me, sent me out into the hall. I had to sit in this little chair in the hall and face the wall. And I couldn't understand what I had done wrong. But when my mother picked me up, she told me, don't tell them you can read. Don't do that. You're going to get into trouble, which is John Lewis's mom. You know, Black mamas don't get into trouble. Every Black person on the call probably has heard that story. So, but I really remember that lesson, right, of white supremacy, which is, don't show who you are until you're invited to, because it's not going to benefit you. It's going to cost you something. And whether that's true or not, it's a message I learned really early from me trying to tell the teacher, I already know how to read. I was so excited about it. And her reaction was, get out of here, face the wall. I'll talk to your mother. And my mother's reaction was, don't cast your pearls before, I don't know the Bible verse, but, but don't shine your light. Don't shine your light until you're invited to. So that idea of being invisible and not being able to be your full self until someone asks for that. Trying to think, is there any other story that wants to rise lastly? I think the last story that I can tell about difference has to do with other people of color. And being in Oregon and Washington, and I grew up in like Camas, Washington. It was very rural and very agricultural. And one of my favorite, and this is bizarre, but one of my favorite things to do was to go berry picking and strawberry picking. And what I loved about it was being with the immigrant and migrant workers, being with the Latinx folk. Oh my gosh, they were so full of love and comfort and beauty and grace and everything wonderful. And so to be on those buses, and the women had tamales and sandwiches, and you'd sit with them, and I could be free in the fields. Like my mom, there was no difference between my mom and the other moms, and we were all in those fields picking, strawberries and picking green beans and apples. And they're some of my favorite childhood memories because I was with other people of color, nourishing one another, sharing food, sharing joy. And I didn't feel a separation between us and them, even though I'm Black and they might be Asian or Latinx or, and there were even poor working class white people in those fields. But when we were in those fields, we were family. And so there was a way that when I think about that story, I think about how, for some reason, the story of white supremacy was not in those fields at that time until the landowners or the people we were picking for showed up. And then you had that felt experience of quiet down, line up, bring your wares, get your strawberry stained dollars, which I can still see in my hand and love the smell of when I was little. And then once back on the bus, it was joy again. So it's a little bit of what I can share.
Yeah. It brings home white privilege to me in maybe even a different way. We traveled across the country by car many summers, from California to Ohio, where my parents were originally from. And never once did I have to be afraid. Never once.
Yeah. I think fear isn't talked about enough as one of the impacts of white supremacy culture. I think we all carry it, honestly. I think we've all inherited a relationship with fear that we would not have inherited if we weren't living in a white supremacist culture.
Yes. Yeah, and down through the generations too, epigenetically, implicitly, and you can feel your grandma.
Oh, so could I.
So that I could tell that. But one thing that was really beautiful too is the way you were sharing your story about what wants to arise now. Just kind of being with it. It was lovely to get to hear.
Thank you. So, Bonnie, I know you had, I think we're getting close, and I know you had something you wanted to read. What else do you want us to do or say?
Let's just check with Joe one more time and just see if there's anything else that's come in. And I don't know, is Joe there?
Hi, here she comes.
Yes, I am.
Yay.
I didn't know if there was anything else that came in the last little bit that we could do before we do our closing.
I think the most poignant question was somebody writing in and asking, are all white people racists and white supremacists?
No. Bonnie, what do you?
I think you need to answer how that is for you, and I can. And
That is absolutely not my experience. Yeah, yeah. No, I think of white supremacy kind of as a worldview, kind of like a perspective. Like all women aren't feminist, right? But feminist is a way of looking at the world that centers the needs of women. But not all women would consider themselves feminist. And so I think that white supremacy is a thought form. That's my feeling about it. It's a worldview, it's a perspective that centers whiteness as dominant and white culture specifically. I mean, whiteness is not an ethnicity, it's a perspective or a worldview. It's not, a place where people are born and all of that. So I think of white supremacy as a worldview that people can align themselves with or not, but it's definitely the dominant worldview in the United States of America right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I would answer that. What would you say, Bonnie?
Well, I would say I think there's a whole range of responses of strong wish for inclusion of everyone, or to not at all, to be, white only or white dominant, as far as how we think about things. I think that as a white person who 6 months ago, somebody asked me if I was a racist, I would have said, I don't think so very much, because I really love people individually and all of that. But I've come to really understand how much I've been marked, just in the way I said right now, of never thinking about, well, I can travel across this country in safety. So I don't know that I would say I'm a racist, but I've certainly been marked by the system in place here in ways that it's important to me to understand how that is and do everything I can to not participate in that way, but to really tenderly hold all the experiences that we're having and see how we move together to change it, so no little Black girl ever has to be in the back of a car and scared.
Yeah.
Thank you for
One person wrote in wanting to check in with you, Vanessa, about how does it feel to have shared the stories that you shared?
Oh, thank you for asking. I was asking myself the same question, so I appreciate someone asking it. Yeah, I was kind of checking in with my body on that. It was pretty scary, actually. Like, I can feel the residual kind of, I never know what the ancestors will send. And they sent some really powerful stories. I literally didn't think about what I wanted to share. I really did, in morning prayer this morning, invited my ancestors. So I'm just like, whatever you want shared today, bring it. And then they sent some really powerful stuff that my body is still going to have to kind of sit with and process. But I thank them for it. Be careful what you ask our creator for, because they will send it.
Right.
And if I can just say one thing about that, Vanessa, one of the things that I've come to realize is that as we have pushed away the cultural part of your community, the white community is so much impoverished by that relationship to the ancestors, by that trust and that arising and that sense of community. We have lost life-giving awareness.
Wow. Yeah. I'm so grateful for what my people have, how I've been guided to be in the world. Sometimes, I struggled with, I shared that I started therapy for the first time when my mom passed, because she was such an important part of my life. And I was like, I will never navigate this world without her well. And one of the first things I learned was this idea of codependency, which I didn't have a great relationship with before. But it was a struggle to understand what that actually meant, because in my culture, we are dependent on one another in a way that is feels inseparable. But I'm coming to understand the differences. But yeah, I'm grateful for our interdependence with one another.
Yeah.
And the multi-generational, from ancestor to how I relate to my descendants. I'm really aware of myself as ancestor as well, and what stories do I carry and pass through to the next generation. I'm always thinking about that in my interactions with the world.
Thank you.
There's a lovely question that may have to be held for the next meeting that asks about the different nature between white fear and black fear.
That is a good question.
Yeah.
Shall we hold that one for next time?
Do you have anything you want to say about it?
Well, I had like two not conflicting, but two not totally synchronous things that came up. One is a white nervous system and a black nervous system is a nervous system. And they're both highly sensitized to danger and safety and eager for safety kind of thing. However, the system in which the nervous system develops is very different for a white person and a black person. And yet I grew up with terror also, but it was within my family too. So I know something about a system that's very sensitive to danger, but in totally different contexts.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah,
not societal. It's not like feeling society is against me, but I certainly didn't feel safety or community in my family. So it's a different presentation of how our nervous systems, all of our nervous systems, care for us.
Yeah, and what comes to me about that is that it's not the fear that's different, it's the threat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And where it comes from, where the source is for us.
How consistent it's applied, how many places of comfort you have access to. I think the threats are different for each of us and for us as individuals, but also for us as community. Because for me, my individual threats are join my brothers and sisters of color collectively too, and I carry their threats as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure we probably will have more to explore around such a big question.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff.
And thank you all for the depth of your inquiries and
awesome questions. So Bonnie, I know we wanted to end with a reading and we have two. Which one do we feel ready to read? What do you think?
I'd like to read the Brian Stevenson piece because I think it ties in with a lot of what we have said most recently today.
Okay.
For those of you who may not know him or know the movie Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson is a Black lawyer that has worked on death row to try to get some kind of justice for incarcerated Black men, but I would imagine anyone there, but I'm most familiar with that. And so this is something he spoke about, sitting with a man named Henry who was on death row and what his experience was, that I think speaks to some of the reconciliation that, we're so about. Henry asked me questions about myself, and I asked him about his life. Within an hour, we were both lost in conversation. I had no right to expect anything from a condemned man on death row. yet he gave me an astonishing measure of his humanity. In that moment, Henry altered something in my understanding of human potential, redemption, and hopefulness. Proximity to the condemned and incarcerated made the question of each person's humanity more urgent and meaningful, including my own. I've also represented people who have committed terrible crimes, but nonetheless struggle to recover and to find redemption. I have discovered deep in the hearts of many condemned and incarcerated people the scattered traces of hope and humanity, seeds of restoration that come to astonishing life when nurtured by very simple interventions. Proximity has taught me some basic and humbling truths, including this vital lesson. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done.
That's beautiful, Bonnie.
Really, really touched me to run across that. And again, I think that as a white person who is part of that legacy of some of the worst things that have ever been done, it's important to hold this, that there is more to us and that we're each in our own way reaching into that and toward each other through proximity.
I love the part that resonates for me is just this idea of flawedness, right? That we all kind of now we all have our flaws, our cultural flaw, like flaws of history, right? The flaws of history and time, the flaws of our own stories, our individuals, our families, and this idea that there's redemption, not in the fact that we're not flawed, but that we're flawed and we allow grace to transform that into something more meaningful than what it was, right? There's something about meaning giving us the key to liberation that feels really in that reading. I can feel that in the reading, that it's not what happened or the perfection that we hope for. It's, can we assign meaning and grace into these situations, into these stories, and allow them to be transformative and to point the way toward liberation.
Yes. And it often comes in the proximity of being together and listening to each other.
Yeah. We are at time, my friend.
I guess, shall we save our other reading for next time?
Absolutely. We will do that.
Well, what a blessing to be here with you, my dear. And thank everybody, Bettina and Laura and Tanner and Joe and everybody for all the support that we're getting in doing this.
Absolutely. And thank you all for being here, for listening to our stories, for sending your questions, for sharing your valuable time. May this message be a balm and a healing, and a story that joins your story. And may we just carry forward healing each other in the world.
Yes, absolutely. See you in 3 weeks.
Yeah, you too, my friend. Bye, everybody.